Well, yeah, well, my Mark Smith New Hampshire North Country radio stations would only be 1,000 watts. I mean, they'd just be 1,000 watts each. It's what I have in mind is a signal behavior that would be very similar to 98.5 in Littleton, New Hampshire. It could barely even make it to Jefferson Village, and likewise, my Mix 97.3, the Treehouse, would broadcast from Jefferson, New Hampshire, yet scarcely make it to Littleton Village in Littleton, New Hampshire. Downtown Littleton, because it'd be smaller. I mean, they would be designed to act tinier than some of the 500-watt stations in the area that act stronger. They would be intended to have the real, it's almost like a local station that only works for a couple of communities. They would not be like the 25,000 watts WXXS KISS 102 FM station that Barry runs, Barry Lunderville. Barry Lunderville runs Radio New England Broadcasting, and limited liabilities company. I would have a similar idea if I ever could make that happen, but my Mark Smith company would be much smaller in size, and it would be kind of like WCFR, that type of idea, how the signal probably covers only a very small area. It might get picked up on community access cable or something like that. My stations would also serve adjacent communities to the ones that those served by Barry Lunderville stations. They would only be 1,000 watts of power, yet they'd act even lower in signal strength than, say, Magic 97.7 WGMT or Free 99.1 WNYN, which both broadcast at only a couple hundred watts, but their signal strengths act very strong because of their high antenna height. I'd be more like smaller, and I think that it would be kind of fun. Just that idea. So, like, one would serve Groveton, which is an adjacent community to Lancaster, a town served by Barry Lunderville's KISS 102 FM, which would remain as the North Country's only hit music station. Lunenburg, Vermont is right over the border to Lancaster, New Hampshire. And so Groveton, New Hampshire, what's great about that community is it's adjacent to the Lancaster, Lunenburg area. And I would do that. And basically they would be almost like a similar idea or theme to Barry P. Lunderville's apparatus, but they would be smaller stations that would pretty much offer less substantial amounts of income and finances than Lunderville's. Plus, I mean, Barry, I've heard, has a lot more experience in the radio business than me, so I would just be a little guy. I'd be, you know, like, for instance, you tune into Dizzy 101.5 FM, that would probably take you to about Lancaster on a handheld Walkman before you start losing it. You might be able to continue receiving Dizzy 101.5 FM in Jefferson Village, but it would be kind of weak at that point. It wouldn't make it very far in the direction of St. Johnsbury. But in Littleton, New Hampshire, I would establish 5-watt low-power FM stereo translators, which would only be 5 watts. And everything power-wise would be a little bit insubstantial in comparison to the big guys. I'm going to keep things little, you know, make the stations small. My stations would be small-town radio stations without websites, and with no intention whatsoever of building websites for them. And so that would make them even more interesting. They would be no hits. Touch that dial. More great music with no hits is just around the corner. Or, touch that dial. More great music with no hits is just around the corner. Thus meaning that the North Country's KISS 102 FM WXXS would remain as the only top 40 station in that region. And let me tell you, there's always a market for top 40. That would be friendly competition. I would air the no hits, and Mr. Lunderville would air the hits. This dream will probably never happen, but let's get into this here. As any of you North Country, New Hampshire residents, or residents of New Hampshire's North Country might be aware of if they live in the Littleton area, there is this new Golden Rate 98.5 station in town, which basically replicates the broadcasting content from the AM counterpart of the WLTN radio apparatus, meaning that Mix 96.7 WLTN, which is eclectic adult contemporary from 1975 through 2009, is complemented by an AM station sharing the same exact call letters, WLTN. And that one is Oldies 1400, originally an all-AM radio station. Well, that AM station, Oldies 1400, Oldies 1400 is now rebroadcast into crystal clear FM stereo via nicknamed Golden Rate 98.5. That signal, power-wise, offers very similar wattage and signal reach characteristics as to what my proposed radio stations would be. My stations would be quadruple the power of the Golden Rate 98.5. But as many of you radio buffs know, and I'm certain Barry Lunderville also knows this, there are certain ways to get stations broadcasting at higher wattage outputs to act weaker than a station broadcasting at a lower wattage. So you could have a 500 watt radio station that acts more powerful than a 25,000 watt station, which 25,000 watts is 50 times more powerful than 500 watts. So what happened? Antenna height. And I'm going to arrange the antenna heights and stuff to make my 1,000 watt station sound like full powered 250 watt FM stereo low power translators. Basically, my stations would all sound like low power FM stereo low power translators set up at full blast, which is 250 watts. Although my stations would be 1,000 watts each, they would sound like they were 250 watt low power FM translators. They might broadcast in mono initially, and then eventually be reincarnated into FM stereo. They would broadcast through the night, but they would all be, programming would be entirely automated. There'd be less on-air professionalism than there would be at the Radio New England Broadcast Group stations, because it would be a lower income business. Maybe the commercials would be for smaller business. Well, for the commercial breaks and the advertisements being aired, I would deliberately aim for companies I did not recognize hearing over the Radio New England Broadcast Group stations. These are all precautionary measures I'm taking. Now note that this is all a complete mental walkthrough. I never had to actually do any of this stuff. I am very enthusiastic towards touring the studios for small-town radio stations without websites. And I sometimes get so excited that I lose track of my politically correctness of it all. That does sound pretty random now, doesn't it? Oh, cool! And the station has no website. Perfect. People will be like, they wouldn't see the logic there. And that's the whole idea. I like it when they have no website or no intention of ever building one, because it makes things more mysterious. Residents of the New Hampshire North Country, particularly the North Country residents of the Littleton, Whitefield, Lancaster, Jefferson, or Groveton areas, try to imagine what it would be like if there was a 97.3 station from Jefferson, the Jefferson Village area, and there was a 101.5 station from Groveton. And these two stations were roughly similar in signal reach to what the Golden Great 98.5 in Littleton is. That's what their power would be like. Picture that the new Mix 97.3, the Treehouse in Jefferson, would be almost exactly the same power-wise as 98.5 in Littleton. It could be like a eclectic counterpart of Mix 96.7, where it's like you only hear eclectic side tracks but no hits. And the signal might just barely make it into Littleton, New Hampshire before dying out. And then there's one in Groveton that was more pop, hip-hop, dance-based, and it could, similarly be close to the power behavior of 98.5 in Littleton. It could, probably got you covered into Lancaster, but everywhere maybe till Prospect Mountain or something. Not make it over to the southern slopes or western slopes of Mount Prospect, but it could be those two stations, they could be additional signals stuck in there to kind of complement the stations of the Radio New England Broadcast Group, but in an all-eclectic, no-hits way. At the bottom of every hour on the 97.3 station in Jefferson would be Citadel Broadcasting's ABC Radio News at every half past. And the Dizzy 101.5 FM in Groveton would feature Fox Radio News, fair and complete, at the half past every hour as well. Another great feature that would help attract listeners to either my stations or Mr. Lunderville's is that we would stop the music for the news breaks at opposite sides of each hour. So when Mr. Lunderville's stations break the music, or so when Mr. Lunderville's stations break for the news, my stations continue playing the music, and then when my stations break for the news at the bottom of every hour, the other stations competing ones would be still playing music. These are all very careful, intricate ideas, kind of courteous competition sort of a deal. And there would be certain songs or certain variants to every song that would be arranged so that, like, if those other stations are airing it, I won't. Groveton, New Hampshire residents, tell me, how would you feel like if, in addition to WXXS KISS 102.3, the North Country's only hit music station, try to imagine what it would feel like to hit the seek button and have it stop on 101.5 FM to recognize a dizzy 101.5 FM that was an all-eclectic, no-hits variant to WXXS. And you could be hearing songs like Don't Mess With My Man by Nivea and Stutter by Joe and Mystical and Public Affair by Jessica Simpson. You could be hearing all these songs that you're not going to hear on a standard top 40 station. And the signal could get you covered until maybe the Whitefield border or the some point in Jefferson, New Hampshire. It could be much smaller than the 25,000 watt neighboring frequency 102.3, but it could be a smaller, sort of more one or two community-based stations that could have Groveton, New Hampshire covered. And maybe there could be like a local access cable station or something in Groveton where the audio from the Dizzy 101.5 FM, which is 101.5, gets featured. Sort of like how WLTN AM Oldies 1400 and its Golden Great 98.5 gets audio featured on the public access Channel 2 station for Littleton, New Hampshire. So that's what I had in mind, or like WCFR, you know, how there's a 106.5, and that station's only not very powerful. It's only meant to serve a couple communities. It's like an oversized high school or college radio station, basically. That's what I would be doing. They'd be a little bit too big to be considered high school or college radio stations, but too small to be full power. So they wouldn't be like full power radio stations. They'd be a little lower power. What I had in mind was, like I said, have my radio stations, the goal, I'm trying to think, have WJGZ Dizzy 101.5 FM up in Groveton, New Hampshire, and WZGJ Mix 97.3 The Treehouse in Jefferson, New Hampshire, be very similar in sound, almost as if they were 250 watt low power FM translators, despite the fact that they would be 1,000 watts each. They would sound as though they were only 250 watt translators. And they'd have a real FM translator feeling to them, even though they were actually legal radio stations with 4-letter call signs. And they would air no hits. Don't touch that dial. It'd be like, don't touch that dial. More great music with no hits is just around the corner. The North Country's radio stations for music without the hits. The North Country's radio stations for music, or the North Country's radio stations for everything but the hits. And obviously, that would be quite the opposite, or reverse to the whole today's hit music scene going on at KISS 102 FM, and that would be the idea. I would see to it that Barry Lunderville would corner the market in the New Hampshire North Country for the top 40 genre, because I would be airing no hits. Hey, want to hear great music? Want to hear no hits at all? That's the idea. Want to hear great music? Want to hear no hits at all? Well, then you got to walk to New Hampshire, to the North Country's no-hit radio stations. We're airing everything but the hits. Tired of the hits? Want to hear something else? Well then, stay tuned and don't touch that dial, because you're tuned to the North Country's no-hit radio stations. Great music with no hits. And what do you guys think of that idea, though? The North Country's radio stations for music without the hits. The North Country's radio stations for great music with no hits. That's why they'd be smaller, by the way, because only, low power FM translator type of community stations could ever get away with, I think, with being no hits. The whole no hits idea. So the North Country's let's try to pronounce that right. The North Country's radio stations for great music with no hits. Dizzy 101.5 FM, 101.5 in Groveton, New Hampshire, and Mix 97.3 The Treehouse, WZGJ Jefferson. Two great North Country radio stations that play great music with no hits. I'd be having a field day about this. I mean, the whole no hits idea. You can't go wrong with that. If any North Country, New Hampshire residents, or any New Hampshire North Country residents, if you wish to know how my radio stations would sound as far as power is concerned, try tuning into the Golden Great 98.5 and picture a signal of the very, identical signal qualities and strength and all that. Picture a station of very similar wattage output and signal behaviors, only instead of Littleton, broadcasting from Groveton and also from Jefferson. Try to picture how a signal of the same exact effective power wattage as 98.5 in Littleton would sound like if you put a station of equal power, effective power behaviors, one in Groveton and one in Jefferson. The one in Jefferson might barely even make it to Littleton, downtown Littleton. Like in your car radio, you might hear it a little bit in mono, probably, with no buildings in the way, that is. And the one from Groveton might make it to roughly the Weeks National State Park, not making it any further south. And the signal for signal for WJGZ, Dizzy 101.5, Groveton, New Hampshire, might not make it anywhere south of the Weeks Weeks State Park. Coming from Groveton, it wouldn't make it anywhere south or west of the Weeks State Park. And the signal for WZGJ, Mix 97.3, The Treehouse in Jefferson, might not make it much anywhere past maybe the whole motel section of West Main Street in Littleton. Between exits 41 and 43 off of I-93. Maybe it's about as far as you get the signal for WZGJ. But I would establish a low-power FM translator, only 5 watts each. Got that, a whopping 5 watts, if that, for both the stations. For WJGZ, Dizzy 101.5 FM in Groveton, New Hampshire, I would wish to establish or set up a 93.3 megahertz 5-watt low-power FM translator. And for WZGJ, Mix 97.3 The Treehouse in Jefferson, New Hampshire, I would love to establish a 5-watt low-power FM translator also in Littleton. This one at the 92.5 megahertz frequency, which would thereby block off any signal reception for Q92.5 in Montreal, but it would only be 5 watts, so it wouldn't be much of a nuisance. Plus, I'm not certain how well the reception from Montreal, Quebec, would be from all the way down in Littleton. The whole purpose of my stations would be to have them be no hits, have them air no hits at all, have them be lower power than the Radio New England Broadcast Group stations, have them be very distinctively from a smaller radio company than Radio New England Broadcast Group, and have them be very noticeably smaller radio stations in many ways. As far as the business operations, the level of budget of the stations, the signal strength, the size of the company, everything in aspect will be smaller. I want them to be very hometown feel. Sort of a similar idea, like I said to you. You turn on the community access cable channel for Littleton, New Hampshire, and you hear sometime, in some cases, the audio from WLTN AM, Oldies 1400, and the Golden Great 98.5. Picture, you're up in Groveton, New Hampshire, further up, and you get that similar idea. You might have a Groveton access cable station, and in their downtime, when they're airing business cards and stuff, you get to hear audio from Dizzy 101.5 FM. Or in Jefferson, New Hampshire, you get like a public access for Jefferson, New Hampshire channel, and you could hear the audio for WZGJ Mix 97.3 The Treehouse for Jefferson. So that's the whole idea. They would sound like low-power FM translators turned up to full blast to 250 watts each, but they would be full-power 1,000-watt stations. They would just be set up in a way where, like I said, where there are ways, and I'm certain that Barry Lunderville probably knows this pretty well. There are plenty of ways of making stations broadcasting at higher wattage outputs to present themselves as sounding like they're weaker than a station broadcasting at a much lower wattage. So you could have stations that are only a couple hundred watts that sound stronger, like they got a better signal than a station broadcasting at 25 or 30,000 watts. It's because it all has to do with where you put your antenna and how high up you put it. I would situate the stations so that they would sound like 250 watt low power FM translator stations, even though they broadcast at 1 kilowatt or 1,000 watts. The stations would be very identical in effective power and radius as, say, 98.5 in Littleton, New Hampshire is. Only picture like a station with the same exact signal strength and characteristics as 98.5 in Littleton, New Hampshire, only instead broadcasting from Groveton or Jefferson. That's in a nutshell what my stations would be like. And again, I would set up low-power FM translators for either of the two stations, both of them rather, right in downtown Littleton, New Hampshire, but I would make them only a couple watts. 5 watts, I believe. Because even the low-power FM translators, I would deliberately rig or set up to be weaker than the Radio New England Broadcast Group stations. I mean, the signals would all behave similarly. You would lose them and get them back in very similar parts of the typography of the land. You know, you'd lose them and get them back all in the same places. But the static and the multipath heard on my stations would be more drastic due to the lack of power in them. You wouldn't be able to get my stations down, up and down I-93. I mean, for instance, driving due north and south along I-93, you get to take WLTN-FM or WXXS-FM a great distance, practically being able to take either of them to Plymouth. I mean, but that's not going to be the way with the ones I own. They're going to be a little weaker. They're not going to be extremely low power, but they're going to be more of that, only intended to service a couple communities feel, such as WCFR, AM 1480, and FM translator via 106.5 translator. That's Springfield, Vermont's Variety, by the way. And it's slated to work only so much in the Springfield, Vermont area. It's sort of exclusive to that town. That's what I have in mind. I'm certain that most radio buffs are no stranger to the different types of radio stations you can have. Now, what I have in mind is, suppose that WEZR AM, EZ 1240, that's the letters E and Z, and then 1240, that's an AM station. But suppose they were to also set up, right in the LA area, an FM translator that would bring up all of the contents and audio from over on AM 1240 up onto crystal clear FM stereo. But the station would only be a couple hundred watts, no greater than 250. And it's probably going to act a lot weaker than, say, 92 Moose or 104.3 WABK. It's going to sound a lot weaker. Or even than Mid-Coast 102.5 WQSS Camden, Rockland, Maine. The thing is that the the low power FM translator for EZ1240 would be weaker and would work in fewer communities. And it would you wouldn't be getting much more luck trying to get the signal to go very far that you would for the original 1240 frequency. That's what I have in mind. I have it in mind to have my stations almost be like FM versions of tiny AM stations, pretty much. They would be almost serve a similar purpose as an AM station. But looking ahead in the future with how dead AM radio is becoming, it would pretty much I would want to build FM variations of the typical low-power community AM radios. Well, yeah, I would be working AM radio, but on the FM dial, due to the fact that I would be up in New Hampshire's North Country. It'd be kind of like how there's WJIB in Boston, Massachusetts. I would make the stations I own serve similar purposes that AM stations would serve, but they would be pushed on over to the FM dial. So WJGZ Dizzy 101.5 FM. In Groveton, New Hampshire, would be 1,000 watts, but it would sound like an FM translator, and it would serve a similar radius that you would consider a local AM spectrum full-service radio station to serve. Similarly, WZGJ Mix 97.3 in Jefferson, New Hampshire, would behave like, it would serve a similar purpose that an AM dial community station would serve. It would serve a similar geographic radius and similar purpose that those AM community stations that play music. Exactly. Except they would serve a very eclectic purpose. Some of the friendly competition ideas would be allowing Mr. Lunderville to continue to corner the market in the top 40 today's hit music, hit with a T, music, and another is allow him to corner the market and having his stations be more powerful. So if there's ever, less than ideal weather conditions or people are out in the sticks, Barry's station to be more likely to be more reliable and dependable as far as the signal strength goes. My stations would serve more of a, they'll work right in town, but if you try to go out hiking in the woods, you might feel very, very tempted or inclined to tune the dial right over to the Radio New England Broadcast Group stations. And note that my stations would be situated fairly close on the dial, so if you start losing them due to lack of power or wattage output, you could just one flick of the seat button would land you on a nearby frequency featuring the much larger counterpart. Like if WZGJ Jefferson Mix 97.3, the Treehouse, starts losing strength, one tap of the frequency seek button might land you down to Mix 96.7 WLTN. Or you're off hiking in the woods at, say, Weeks State Park, and you notice that your handheld Walkman is starting to run into some struggles trying to receive WJGZ Dizzy 101.5 FM from Groveton. So you tap the seek button up one and it stops, it lands on 102.3. And you're going, this station's coming in much better. I'm going to keep it on this for now. Thereby earning the Radio New England Broadcast Group some more valuable listeners, for instance. And that's how I would do it, is there would be, as soon as listeners start losing my stations, a single-handed tap to the seek button will land them on a nearby frequency, which would happen to consist of programming from one of Mr. Lunderville's stations. His stations would have more money available. So, advertisers are obviously going to be more enthusiastic or feel more inclined to go flocking to his stations because they can offer more, pretty much. But my stations would serve more of a single-handed, exclusive involvement feel to the communities that are adjacent to the towns that are spotlighted on Radio New England Broadcast Group stations. So, for instance, I might feature a spotlight on, for Groveton, New Hampshire, or for Jefferson, New Hampshire. Two communities that neither of get spotlighted on the news. Groveton and Jefferson, or Bethlehem, for instance. All communities of which neither get spotlighted on the Radio New England Broadcast Group. So I would be seeking out communities that were adjacent or right next to towns that get heavy on-air sponsorship. So I would not have heavy influence over Littleton, New Hampshire, but I would seek out neighboring places like Sugar Hill and Bethlehem and Jefferson and Groveton and stuff, and serve those communities through and through. They're much smaller, which is all right, because my stations would be smaller in power and not have the same oomph that the other ones have. I do believe that Oldies 1400 / the Golden Great 98.5 is the tiniest, most smallest radio station that's the most lacking in power and signal coverage of the Radio New England Broadcast Group. All of my stations would be more like that one. And like I said, have a really localized appeal. Having the very focus be centered around the spotlighting of communities I'm at that are adjacent to the towns spotlighted on WLTN or on WXXS. Littleton, New Hampshire does in fact get its chance to shine over WLTN FM or even WXXS. But what about Sugar Hill? And what about Bethlehem? And what about Monroe? And what about Jefferson? What about Groveton? So that's what I'd be doing. We would not hit Randolph. Well, I don't know, maybe. I mean, that's another small town. Randolph of the New Hampshire variety, I should say. You know what, though? No 25,000 watts. That's definitely, listen to WCFR at some point. WCFR is AM 1480, and it offers crystal clear, crisp FM stereo quality sound over the airwaves via their 106.5 frequency, also coming from the same location, Springfield, Vermont. Similar to what Oldies 1400 WLTN does with their new Golden Great 98.5 signal. Or try to picture or imagine what it would be like to have WEZR AM, EZ 1240 in Lewiston, Auburn, Maine area, also broadcast off the FM dial through a new FM translator in stereo. That's how my stations would be, only they would originate from the FM dial, not the AM dial. But they would sound as if, they would be designed to sound or have the auditory presentation of being almost like as though they were FM translators to primarily AM stations. But they would not be AM stations. They would just sound as though they were FM rebroadcast to an AM station. And they would definitely have that local access cable audio providing that feel of a station you might picture hearing on a local access cable station during their off hours when they just air the calling cards and business advertisement cards for, where they air all the slides of the local businesses, sticking strictly to that community. That's what I would do. That's the feel I would try to commit to for WJGZ Dizzy 101.5 FM in Groveton, New Hampshire, as well as WZGJ, the new Mix 97.3, the Treehouse in Jefferson, New Hampshire. They would be no hits at all, thereby allowing the Radio New England Broadcast Group the perfect opportunity to corner the market with the region's only top 40 hit music radio station, that being Hits 102 FM WXXS. They could remain as the only station that plays the mainstream top 40, or the top 40 powerhouse. They could remain as the only 25,000 watt station in town, and a very reliable signal that could be heard all throughout the North Country, rather than just being heard on a couple stations. A couple communities, rather. Just talking about this idea really makes my mouth water, I'm telling you. I'm drooling over this idea. I don't know, again, I lack the years of experience. I'm no radio veteran by a long shot. So, you might, getting tongue-tied, you might end up hearing more instances of technical difficulties, such as dead air, or songs abruptly cutting off for no apparent reason, or all that kind of stuff. My stations would be set to sound as though they were FM. They're going to sound like FM translator stations for AM signals. That's what they're going to sound like. They're going to have a similar behavior. With just the general on-air presentation, based on the way they act and the type of things, like, for instance, feeding the audio onto a local public access cable channel or all that kind of stuff. Those things, you're going to assume it's probably an AM station, because they're going to serve similar purposes that many small town community AM dial full service stations will serve, whereas often supplemented or complemented by a low power FM translator that acts much weaker than the local full power FM stations. I would serve the purpose, but I would jump immediately to the FM dial, as in this day and age, several multiple AM community stations as such that serve the full service in musical formats, they're applying for construction permits to be moved over to the FM dial. This effect is particularly happening up north of the border in Canada. Only with me, there will be no construction permit to move an AM frequency onto the FM dial. What there will be instead will be an initial building right onto the FM dial directly. But I'll have an antenna or a broadcasting tower or transmitter set up to provide my stations with the feeling or the type of appeal of being like low power FM stereo translators. Even though they'd be an entire 1,000 watts, they would be designed to sound as though they were low power FM translators. And the broadcasting content and the very nature of the stations would have you easily confused or deceived into feeling truly convinced that what you are in fact listening to is an FM stereo translator to a primarily AM station, such as tuning into the Golden Great 98.5. You know, you're actually listening to an AM station. So you would think by listening to WJGZ, Dizzy 101.5 FM in Groveton, New Hampshire, as well as WZGJ, Mix 97.3 The Treehouse in Jefferson, New Hampshire, you could easily mistake both of the stations for being low-power FM translators for AM stations, based on the whole very, microscopic, only intended to serve one or two communities type of appeal, and the way that they present themselves, and the level of inexperience, and all that kind of the lack of size of the company. That's what it is. I really drool over this idea. I won't lie here. This is really something I would definitely do. And I wouldn't do it because I would do it. I would do it because I really want to do it. Because it's truly something that I feel motivated and inclined to do. It definitely sounds like a lot of fun. And I wouldn't mind getting the chance to do that. Let's see where this goes. I feel highly inclined. This is what the logo looks like, by the way. Jefferson's own, or Whitefield's own, Mix 97.3, The Treehouse. Great music. No hits. So what would you think of this? What would you think of the station here? Not bad, huh? And this is the type of feeling it would have. Kind of like Springfield's Variety, where you get the it's also on the FM dial, and it's much weaker than most FM stations. For instance, you see where you got only 10 watts, but then the local hot AC station is 6 kilowatts, 92.3, or how there's say how there's WMXR. That station is an entire 670 watts. Yet that station acts more powerful because of the location of the transmitter or the antenna. It's kind of set up to sound like it's a couple thousand watts, even though it's only a couple hundred. I would set up this station so that it could be, although it's an entire kilowatt or 1,000 watts, it's going to sound weaker than many stations that are half or even less the power. Half or even less. What do you think of this idea, though? How do you think it would do? How do you think my no-hits music format would perform? This was definitely lots of fun. You're tuned to the North Country's radio stations for great music with no hits. You're tuned to the North Country's radio stations for music without the hits. Or, you're tuned to the North Country's radio stations for music without the hits. WJGZ, Dizzy 101.5 FM Groveton, and WZGJ, Mix 97.3 The Treehouse in Jefferson. Two radio stations playing great music with no hits. Two great hometown radio stations playing music with no hits. What do you think of making an entire format off of the no-hits idea? Anybody who's into radio, what would you think of this? And anybody who lives in the New Hampshire North Country, what would you think of this station? Jefferson and Whitefield. Its very own radio station for Jefferson and Whitefield that would focus entirely on that community. It would have be assigned the call sign of WZGJ, be 1,000 watts. It would be very similar in effective power wattage as to what 98.5 in Littleton is. That's how strong it would act. And it would be it would have a very only serve exclusively Jefferson and Whitefield's needs. It would be an eclectic counterpart to, say, Mix 96.7 WLTN, which would have a much stronger signal, but it would spotlight Whitefield and Jefferson exclusively. It would have the real hometown, only meant to serve a couple communities type of feel. It would have a real AM full-service radio station type of a presentation to it, only it would be in crystal clear FM stereo. Do you like this idea? Do you think it would soar? Do you think it would not score? Would it be a score? Would it be a bore? Would it be a score or would it be a bore? Please let me know. Again, here it is. Would it be a score or would it be a bore? You tell me. Especially if you come from New Hampshire's North Country. What would it air? The formatting would be very similar to that of Mix 96.7 WLTN, except that there would be no hits at all. And it would be eclectic, but it would be adjacent but not equal track selections to Mix. But it would only serve a smaller listening radius and a smaller broadcast area, smaller broadcast radius or listening area, thereby meaning that even if I did play a couple songs from over at WLTN FM, it wouldn't make it out of the very small listening area. Do you think this idea would be interesting? Suit the needs of individuals exclusively in Jefferson or Whitefield? You let me know. Please do reply to this video. This is Mark Smith from New England, Eastern Massachusetts, signing off. Thank you very much for listening and watching.